Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you today, and this one is kind of a little Christmas present to me. I've wanted to do this game for a while, but it's not that popular, and this video won't get a lot of views, but I don't care, so here it is anyway. This is my comparison of the arcade and Genesis/Mega Drive versions of Toaplan's Hellfire. Here's the specs of the arcade and home hardware, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. Toaplan, best known for their overhead shooters like Truxton and Twin Cobra, released the side-scrolling shooter Hellfire into the arcades in April 1989 in Japan and September 1989 in the US. In both of those regions, it was published by Taito. Arcade Hellfire is a fun but difficult shooter with a pretty nice grungy, metal-y style soundtrack. It's got 6 levels, supports 2-player simultaneous play, has a button to toggle between 4 firing directions, and when you die you respawn right where you left off. It's light on power-up variety, you just kind of power up your main lasers a whole bunch and get some speed boosters and bonuses. So it's pretty basic, but it's fun. In the fall of 1990, a port to the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive by NCS was released. It was published by different companies in different territories. Here in the US, it was published by Seismic, who also brought Musha over here. The Genesis port of Hellfire is pretty good. In most respects, I'd say it's even better than the arcade original, with just a few exceptions. So what's better about it? Well, the music sounds better for one. They added a few new power-ups like an option/satellite type thing and a shield. They made bonuses multiply the more you get instead of just getting a flat set amount every time, and they added high-speed scrolling to boss and mini-boss fights and more. In some ways, well, it's a little worse. There's no 2-player simultaneous play in this version. Some parallax backgrounds were omitted, a la the Genesis port of Ghouls and Ghosts, and there are some changes that some people may like more or less as compared to the arcade original, depending on their personal taste. Oh, and there are also 3 different endings. You get a different ending for each of the game's 3 difficulty levels. The 3rd difficulty level is hidden behind a trick on the options screen if you weren't aware. On to recording methodology. I used save states, because for this game, of course I did. Hellfire is tough, and I wanted to keep parity between the 2 versions as best I could. And, because I'm short on time, I'm going to ad-lib this comparison instead of writing it beforehand. That's about it, I guess. Let's get on with it. Alrighty, here we go. The arcade version has this nice sort of transition effect where everything generates from lines on the screen until we get the full picture. The blasters are a different color on the mothership that drops you off at the beginning. The space background is quite a lot different between the 2 here, which is kind of strange since the background that you see in the arcade version is present in the Genesis version, they just kind of use it only in the last level. As you can see, a lot of the foreground elements and tiles were redesigned for the Genesis version of the game. And then, as we'll see soon, the weapons, especially the higher levels of the powered-up lasers, work quite a bit differently in the Genesis and arcade versions. Oh, and that thing I just picked up there on the Genesis one, that's a Hellfire icon. The Genesis version adds a Hellfire laser. It's a really huge laser that clears all bullets and minor enemies off the screen and does some damage to larger enemies. As we sort of get into the proper area of the first level, we can see that the background designs and the tiles are a lot different between the 2 games. And for the most part, I actually prefer the redesigned levels that they have in the Genesis game. I just think it looks a little nicer and I like the colors better. Now, as you can see, in arcade Hellfire, I've already got the lasers powered up all the way, and you fire out these huge long laser beams, and there's a big gap where there's no fire in front of the ship because the firing rate is so low on those lasers. In the Genesis version, you'll see when you get the fully powered up laser, the beams are a lot smaller, but there's a much shorter gap in between how often you can fire them. So in the Genesis version, you get a lot better coverage. You're not defenseless as long. And here's the little satellite option thing in the Genesis I was talking about also. It just kind of does its own thing and floats around the screen looking for things to ram into. And if you didn't notice, the little dash symbol on the Genesis version is a shield. it lets you absorb 1 bullet hit. And I picked that up just a little bit earlier. As you can see, the level layout and scrolling speed in this level is really close between the two versions. And the enemies are laid out very similarly also. And here you can really see what I was talking about with the different firing rates and sizes of the laser beams. And here's our first of many pauses where the games sort of get out of sync with each other. We're coming up to the first mid-level boss. And here's another change on the Genesis. When you're fighting the mid-level bosses or the end-level bosses, it has really fast scrolling to kind of drive home the action of the scene. Something else you'll notice here is they redesigned this mid-level boss ship in the Genesis version. I think it looks a lot better, but I do kind of miss the thrusters that fire as it changes directions in the arcade version. It's too bad they didn't include that in the Genesis port. Alright, and there we go, took them out of both of them. And as you can see here, the backgrounds in the arcade have a slightly more large variety of tiles. So we have the little strips that sort of widen, those vertical strips in the background. Also, the ones in the background on the Genesis are a little darker and maybe higher contrast. Looks a little less mushy. And again, I prefer the more silvery or metallic colors that we see of the foreground objects in the Genesis version versus the arcade one. Another thing I'll point out here is the arcade version suffers from a lot more slowdown than the Genesis version does also. Oh, and for all the bonus icons, I don't know if you caught this earlier, but I mentioned it at the start of this video. In the Genesis, when you pick it up, they're worth a very... Well, when you pick your first one up, they're worth a very small amount of points, and that point amount goes up for every successive one you pick up without dying until you hit 10,000. After that, they're all worth 10,000. In the arcade version, it's pretty much just a flat rate of 2,000 for the bonus icons. And now here comes our first full boss fight. Looks a little different on the Genesis, and the biggest thing that was cut out from that version is the lines on the inside of the boss don't flash like they do in the arcade one. See how they slowly flash there? There's also sort of a shadow on the orb in the arcade version that is missing from the Genesis one. And for this first boss, it really takes advantage of the play mechanics of the game, letting you change your firing direction. We actually don't see a whole lot of things that specifically take advantage of that, so it's kind of a shame they do that so early on, and don't really incorporate it much later. Anyway, there's our level 1 cleared. For the clear graphic on the Genesis, there's no stars in the background. And here we begin level 2. This is my least favorite level in the game. It's the least interesting, and it's got by far the most annoying music. In the Genesis version, the stuff in the background is a lot darker, which is kind of a theme there. In the arcade version, we can also kind of see the Sphinx in the pyramid or in front of it, and that's missing from the Genesis port. You can see there's definitely way fewer colors on the background in the Genesis. There's much less of a gradient in the sky and a lot more dithering. I'm sure by now you've noticed that annoying music that I've been telling you about just a few seconds ago. And yeah, it's annoying. It's really grated. I don't know what they were thinking or why they thought this was good. But hey, they can't all be winners, right? And there is a general theme that most of the backgrounds, especially the parallax layer, the depth background, they're darker in the Genesis port almost universally. And I think that was a purposeful choice here. They didn't have to do that. If I had to guess, I would say that that was done just to make, the bullets and everything stand out a little bit more, so it's a little bit easier to actually play the game. Because there are parts of the background in the arcade version that I feel like not so much the bullets, but sometimes your ship kind of blends in with, and it's a little hard to see. So at least, I haven't read any interviews or anything, but that's my theory on why the backgrounds are so much darker in the Genesis port. It is much easier to see your ship in that one. And here you can see what I was talking about earlier with the very large lasers of the arcade game and their slow firing rate. Having the lasers be that size really doesn't do any good. It's worse than the smaller, faster lasers of the Genesis because it leaves the ship more open to getting smashed into, either by the small, quick-moving enemies or by an enemy from a big wave of those tiny enemies. Now, for some unknown reason here, the background layer on the Genesis version just fades out and goes away for this whole part. I have no idea why they did this. I mean, I guess I kinda have one theory, and I'll tell you what that is, but I'm not sure that it's right, so it's just a theory. And it'd be kind of funny if what I'm thinking is what it actually is. Maybe one of you can go check for me. I was thinking that maybe for the parts of these statues that are moving diagonally, they might have put those on a separate background layer instead of making them sprites. And then as we get into this next section of the level, the star background is missing here again. They've also simplified the background in general on here. The pattern is not as complex as the arcade game, which is to be expected with the limitations of the Genesis. And as you can see, once again, the layout of the level and the enemies is pretty faithful. One other thing I hadn't pointed out is those ships you shoot to get your power-ups out of, they're actually animated on the Genesis and redesigned, and they look better than the arcade version, in which they're just static things that just sit there. We're almost up to the boss of this area. Just a little tiny ways to go. For the moving platforms, they changed up the coloring a little bit. Nothing too serious. They did a nice job on these statues on the Genesis version, I must say. And here it comes. I find this to be one of the most annoying bosses in the game. The design is a little more complex in the arcade version. Oh, the way the sarcophagus looks here. But I don't know. It looks kind of weird how it's just half on the top and half on the bottom. I kind of like the design on the Genesis version, where it's got a solid base that's not part of the design. But that's all going to be preference. I can easily see someone preferring the arcade version in this case. Anyway, that'll do it for level 2. So we go from my least favorite level in the arcade game and Genesis port to my favorite level in each. And why is this my favorite level in each? Well, it's gotta be because of the awesome soundtrack here. The music in this level is fantastic. It's got this high energy part coming up, I don't know, about 40 seconds in that's really great. And the only real graphical difference here are the higher contrast colors that they've chosen again in the Genesis port. Both for the vines and the ball things in the background, and even for the weird sort of geometric shapes that make up the rock formations in the foreground. I've got to say, I don't often find a use for the direct, straight up and down vertical fire in this game, but this area here is one place where it actually is pretty useful. There's also a couple of boss fights where it can help you out a little bit. And I've got to say, just Switching gears a little bit, Hellfire in general, I mean, it's not a classic game. It's not as good as Gradius or an R-Type. It doesn't require a lot of careful planning and strategy, but what it does require is basically one simple strategy, and that is you've got to take out enemies basically as soon as they appear so they don't get a chance to fire at you. Really, it's being offensively defensive, I guess I would call it. Because if you leave enemies on the screen and give them a chance to fire, the screen will be riddled with bullets, and you will not be able to avoid them all. So after we take out that first mid-level boss, we get to our next section of the level, in which balls try to crush our head. Which is thankfully a problem I don't ever have in real life. If you're wondering if those hopping guys are super annoying, the answer is yes. Yes, they are. They're really annoying. Especially on the arcade version, with your super slow firing rate and those giant lasers. If you end up missing one, and missing one is easier than it sounds because their hitbox is kind of small, it's a long time, before you can fire again and hit them. And it's pretty easy for them to just crash into your ship and take you out. And this is another stage also where the Genesis soundtrack, which we're listening to now, is vastly superior to the arcade original. We're about to come up to mini-boss number 2, which will be kind of familiar. You'll see what I mean in just a couple of seconds here. Yep, it's basically the same as the first thing, only instead of having really long arms, we've got 3 of them with really short arms. This also kind of reminds me of the first level in Truxton a little bit. And yeah, it's every bit as annoying. When you first play this game, you're gonna die on this part. I pretty much guarantee it. And don't let the thing that says easy in the upper left corner of the Genesis version fool you. Even on easy, the Genesis version of this game is incredibly hard. If you're not, a shooter or shmup expert, you will get creamed by this game. It will destroy you over and over again. And the annoying thing in the Genesis version is that when you die in this one, it uses restart points. As we move into the last section of the level here, we see the design is a little less complex on the Genesis version and the background is a little bit darker. I prefer the colors, but the design is a little nicer in the arcade original. As far as gameplay strategies go, well, you're going to use the same one. I guess one other thing I should point out here that I haven't mentioned yet is Hellfire on the Genesis has one of the most annoying quirks of arcade ports from this era. And that is, you have to move up and down to scroll the screen up and down to see the entirety of the vertical space, which is something you did not have to do in the arcade version. You might be wondering why this happened so much in the 16-bit era, whether it was a game released for, the Genesis, the Super Nintendo, or the PC Engine. And the reason is resolution differences in most cases. And that's the reason here too. The arcade game had a vertical resolution of 240 pixels, while the Genesis has a vertical resolution of 224. Also, the HUD takes up more space on top of the Genesis screen than it does on the arcade one, which exacerbates things a little bit. And here comes our third level boss. And the Hellfire laser, which you'll see me actually using here, is not really particularly useful. It doesn't seem like it does much damage to enemies. What it is good at is clearing the screen of bullets, which can help you out in a pinch if there's a whole bunch on screen at once. But anyway, there's our level finished. Now we'll move on to my second favorite level in the game in each version, level 4. Now this one, I understand that they were going, for a higher contrast background, and especially to go darker to make it easier to see things, but I think in the Genesis port they made this one a little too dark. Also, if you didn't notice, the walker in the Genesis version can be completely destroyed, while in the arcade version, you can only blow up some of the guns on it. And then it hangs around on the screen as an obstacle you have to avoid for a few seconds after that. I don't know why they made this gameplay change. It was pretty interesting the way the arcade version handled it. The Genesis could clearly handle having the walkers on the screen with plenty of other sprites without any issue. So, I don't know why they made that decision. It's kind of weird. Overall, it does kind of make this part a little bit easier, which for a game as hard as this one, I guess is mostly a plus. And you can see the little satellite power-up thing in the Genesis version is not particularly useful. Every now and then it can land a hit on some small enemies, or maybe do a very slight amount of damage to a boss or a mid-boss. Most of the time, it just kind of flies around doing its own thing and doesn't have much of an impact on the rest of the game. So in the end, it wasn't exactly the most compelling addition to Hellfire. Now as we come up to this second section of the level, I actually kind of prefer the starfields in the Genesis one. It looks a little nicer, I think. A little fuller. In the arcade version, some of them twinkle a little bit, which is a nice effect, and it's too bad they didn't replicate that in the Genesis one. I'll also point out here that in this particular level, I think the music is also way better on Genesis than it is in the arcade. And what you'll see coming up here in just a second or two is the next main obstacle in this section looks a little different in each version. In the Genesis version, it sprouts up quicker, and it also flashes, drawing your attention to it that it's something that's, gonna do some kind of damage to you if you don't pay attention to it right away. There's another one. You can see in the arcade it rises slowly and just goes back down almost as slowly. It's just kind of there for a split second and then gone. In the Genesis version, it pops up, spouts out, a bunch of the enemies, and then goes down. Which, the sequence of events is the same, but the speed at which they occur is different. And here we are getting ready to move into the next section of the level, which is the final section before the boss. And the enemy layouts are basically the same, but their timing is a little different. You might not see as many of those things on the screen at once in either version at any given time. That's because very often I'm shooting them right as they emerge from the side of the screen and you can't see that. If I was thinking when I was playing, I should have let them come up on the screen so you could see them all in both versions, but I didn't, so oh well. I cared more about trying to actually survive. Now this is a part that does make use of the multi-directional firing, especially forward and backward, because you don't know which side these things are coming from until you've played this a few times. And then even when you do, there's so many waves of them that it's really hard to remember all of them. I could do it as a kid, but I find it much harder to do in my advanced old decrepit age. And again, still the same deal with the walkers. You blow them up in this section instead of just disabling them while they walk around like they do in the arcade one. Here the timing's a little different. You will notice that in some levels, the scrolling happens a little faster in the Genesis port than it does in the arcade game. And this is not due to the horizontal resolution because, well, that's the same between the two versions. Now here is a super annoying boss, especially in the arcade version. In the arcade one, it just litters the screen with bullets, and you've got to take them out as quickly as possible. And you might have just seen in the arcade one, the enemies reversed and started to turn around and go the opposite direction. They will do that on Genesis also, if you let them hang around long enough. I didn't let them hang around long enough, so you didn't really get a look at it. You might have seen just a brief split second of it. And then when you're down to just one enemy, the pattern's a little different again in the arcade game. Honestly, don't remember if it does that in the Genesis with the single one left or not. Alright, level 5, and once again we see quite a different color scheme in the background, and these big machines in the foreground look a lot different. I think they look much nicer in the Genesis port. They look more complex and the shading is better. So yeah, we've got quite a few of these things to go through. I also kind of like in the Genesis version how, like at the last second before they go off screen, they just speed away. I don't know why they added that, but it's kind of funny. And in this section with these little snaky pole things that unleash a bunch of little enemies, I think they look a lot nicer in the Genesis version also. Again, the shading and the colors just look better on them to me. But you may think otherwise, and I understand that. And this game does hate you. It constantly puts things in the way of where it knows you're going to be, so it can tell when it's sort of shepherding you towards the front of the screen. Whenever that's happening, get ready to back off as quick as you can, because there's going to be something in your way that you're going to crash into. Now this next section coming up here, the very beginning of it, is quite different between the two versions. You'll see what I mean in just a split second here. So in the Genesis, these things unleash missiles at you like crazy right away. And it's tough to avoid them and get in there and shoot them without, losing a life. And remember, losing a life in that version means getting sent back to a checkpoint and losing all your power-ups. In the arcade version, a thing is slowly revealed with a bunch of guns that just shoot regular bullets at you, which are much easier to avoid. For this next section here, again, the layout is pretty much identical between the two games. I like the sort of dark blue color scheme better in the arcade version for the background. I think it looks a lot nicer than what they did on the Genesis, which is mostly just kind of black. But I do like the piping around the outline of the foreground a lot better in the Genesis version. It just looks much nicer, a lot fancier. This is another part that does kind of make use of the multi-directional fire. But for a lot of this, you can speed through it and avoid the bullets without actually taking out the guns. It's just what you prefer. Me, I prefer taking them out because they can't shoot you if they're not there anymore. Alright, and here we go into our next major section of the level. In the arcade one, it's got this nice little part with bent-up destroyed railings. In the Genesis version, that design's a little simpler. And then these things are really similar to the way they were at the beginning of the level. What gets different here is the frequency at which they emerge, and basically how close together they are. Especially in the arcade one. You'll see what I mean very shortly here. And also, if you don't take out those little, turret face, gunship robots, you could be in a lot of trouble real quickly. Because they themselves will occupy a lot of space, and they'll put a lot of bullets all over the place. Now here's another section where in the arcade game, we have a nice background in the parallax layer, while in the Genesis version, they eliminate the background completely from this point. And I don't really understand why they did that here. I can't think of any technical reason. They do switch from horizontal to vertical scrolling in a moment, and it's really the only section of the game where there's a significant amount of vertical scrolling. There's a slight exception to that in level 6 in the arcade. But, like I said, in the arcade version, they didn't even bother scrolling the parallax layer down, they just kind of left it there. So I especially don't see why they couldn't have done that in the Genesis port. If anybody has any insight into that, feel free to let me know in the comments. You'll also notice a slightly different playstyle here. In the Genesis version, I get down there and shoot the things as soon as they emerge. On the arcade version, I let them kind of get a few shots off before I go down and take them out. Basically, that's the playing it safe way of doing it. And we're up to the boss here, which is just a whole bunch of guns on this little gun wall. You can see after even hitting it with the Hellfire blast, it didn't do any more damage, really, it's seemingly, than any of your regular shots. Alright, that is stage 5 in the books. We've only got one stage left, and this stage is a lot different in both games. Now that big long swirl on the left side of the screen, that's on the Genesis what I was talking about they could have put into the first level. All they needed to do was just, change the colors on the tiles. So I really don't know why they left that out and just went with the plain star background in that area. Now here's the huge difference. These ships look really similar. In the arcade version they have some extra attacks, and in the Genesis version you can completely destroy them, while in the arcade version you just destroy the guns, and then the ships remain as an obstacle floating around the level for a while. So that is not unlike what we saw with the walkers in level 4. And avoiding these ships is a real pain in the butt in the arcade version. It's one of those things that I'm kind of glad is gone from the Genesis port, but it does change the gameplay a little bit. And there are some differences in coloring here, which, of course there are going to be. And the ships, these big ships, are slightly smaller in the Genesis version, but it's not a big difference. There are parts where you can have sort of two of them on the screen at once on Genesis, but it doesn't occur nearly as frequently as it does in the arcade game, mainly because you can completely destroy them in the Genesis, whereas you cannot in the arcade game, as previously discussed. So here we're heading into our second section of the level, and here the background is a little bit nicer on the Genesis. There's a little bit more variety in it. I think I do prefer the foreground colors in the arcade version, though. If you're somebody who cares about points in shooters or shmups, you'll notice there's a pretty big discrepancy between the two games, and that's because primarily of the way the bonuses work. Which, I told you all about that earlier. You have the potential to rack up way more bonus points on Genesis than the arcade original. Once again, the big ships are real similar in both here, but again, like with the first design of big ship, in the Genesis you can completely destroy it, in the arcade version you can't. So that does make things play pretty differently here between these two versions of the game. Yeah, that's a lot of stuff going on at once on screen on the arcade one. And look at this on the Genesis. This section with the missiles is exclusive to this version. And it's got extra parallax here that is now present in the arcade game for the space scenes. Now in the arcade game, it's got its own little unique section here, where you're going through this section where the foreground kind of scrolls erratically. You'll see it move vertically, either up or down every now and then, while it continues to move to the left. And this part in the arcade is a giant pain in the butt. I kind of like the missile section better in the Genesis game than this moving section in the arcade game. The missile section is easier, but at least it's something different. This section in the arcade game, you gotta be really good or lucky to survive it without dying. And Hellfire is one of those games where, if you die and lose all your power-ups, especially this close to the end, you may as well start over from the beginning, because you're not going to beat the game. And for this third style of big ship, once again, in the Genesis version we can destroy it, in the arcade version we can only blow up its guns. I'll also point out here again, on Genesis we have 2 layers of scrolling, on the arcade we only have 1 here. I guess I'll also point out here that Once again, I prefer the Genesis music in this level, but it's not the best song in the game in either version. And we are almost up to the game's final boss, which is pretty easy if you know what you're doing, and almost impossible if you don't. And I'll explain, and I'll have to be brief because he doesn't survive very long. But we're almost there. Here he is. So he's got this shield he moves up and down, and you might be inclined to attack him from the front, at which point you can only hit him when the shield is down. But if you get above him or behind him, you can just change directions and take him out pretty easily. And on the Genesis version especially, you can shoot down those missiles he fires out, which makes taking him out from above really easy. In the arcade version, you can't shoot those missiles, so you gotta be a lot more careful, but he still goes down pretty easily, as you can see here. Alright, and then when we beat the arcade game, we get this single little graphic with our little congratulations message. For the Genesis version, we get the cool little scene of the planet or whatever exploding, and then we change to the ship with its little rotating section here and this little wall of text, while we see a cool little star design. Now I will also point out here, as I mentioned earlier on, the ending in the Genesis version is different depending on the difficulty level at which you finish the game. And as you can see in the text, it kind of even tells you that right here. Although, I actually think this ending looks better than the other two on the harder difficulty levels. Basically, you see an anime character talking to you if you get the other endings. But it's just a simple still shot, it's nothing fancy. And that, my friends, is Hellfire. Okay, so there we are, the complete playthrough of Arcade vs. Genesis / Mega Drive Hellfire. In the end, aside from some minor graphical cutbacks, I feel like almost everything is better in the Genesis port. I prefer the smaller lasers with the higher firing rate of the fully powered up weapons. The Genesis soundtrack gets a bit of an edge over the arcade original. The new power-ups add much needed variety to the game, even though there's just a little bit, but that one-hit shield in particular is a godsend. So as I've said before, Hellfire isn't the greatest horizontal shooter either in the arcade or on the Genesis, but the Genesis port does exceed the arcade game, and unless you really want to play 2 players, I'd say absolutely play the Genesis version instead for the best experience. Now there is also a version of Hellfire for the PC Engine CD, and I might take a look at that very soon. Whether I do that or not, know this. It does have the 2-player simultaneous play of the arcade game, but is basically worse in every other way, and that includes the music, which they did not translate well to Red Book audio. Anyway, what do you think? Tell me which version of Hellfire is your favorite and why in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you'll know whenever there's a new video out. If you want to support the channel and the crazy work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon or Ko-fi. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.